Hi, I'm Greg Farrar, and this is my almost daily COVID trends live stream. I'll be going over the trends for the countries of the world, the states of the United States, and the counties of California. So let's start with the countries. As always, the United States far in the lead in total cases, followed by Spain and Italy, Germany and United Kingdom, France and Turkey, Iran. Um, Total numbers, though, don't show as much where things are going. It's harder to read those graphs, I think. So I tend to like one level down, which is the number of new cases each day, and better yet, two levels down, which is the rate of change in the number of new cases each day. We'll start with the new cases each day. You can see the United States is visibly leveled out and heading probably slightly downward. That's good. Let's look at some other countries in this chart. Actually, I'm going to switch to per capita view so we can compare them. This is the breakdown in by million people. As you can see, the United States is no longer far and away ahead of everybody in this graph. In fact, it's not even in the lead. The leader in terms of new cases per capita is Ireland, which has the unfortunate double whammy of not only having way more cases per capita than anyone each day, but also it's not leveling off, or maybe just barely. It's a little hard to see. You can see one point here where it had a relatively low number, though still way above everyone else. But we'll see on the next graph whether Ireland is really leveling off or not. One could imagine, looking at the shape of that curve, that it's not quite a line, but maybe headed slightly downward. But the other major players have leveled off. Almost all of them have leveled off or are looking like they're headed that way. Spain, though, as we can see, it doesn't have this nice shape of having gone up, flattened, and gone straight down. It did head down, and now it's heading down at what really seems like less of a sharp angle. So that suggests that Spain's actually not recovering as fast as some of these others, but it is recovering. The number of cases is dropping each day on average, though that may change given the trend of the way that curve's bending. Belgium is second place, has peaked and is now dropping, so it's doing okay. The United States, as we saw, has leveled off, or maybe slightly. It's in about third place with third place in terms of per capita new cases, followed by the United Kingdom and Sweden. Sweden also not yet leveled off, as we can tell from here. There are a few other ones that we can see have leveled off, like Austria, obviously heading down. You can see it cutting across the graph if I can pick it out. Germany, that one looks like. Probably, is that Israel? I think so, yeah. Israel also heading downward. But now when we start to try to pick out the slopes of random lines in this graph, it's time to look at the rope chart instead. This chart will tell us much more precisely and visually what direction countries are headed. Are they actually speeding up towards recovery, or are they getting worse? Now, a week ago even, I think I started this about 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago, I was pointing to what looked like a trend towards recovery. A lot of countries were starting to head downward. They hadn't turned the corner towards zero growth yet, but they were looking like they were headed that way. And then we reached a place where it really seemed like the countries it was around here. If you look right around here on April 7th, everyone was kind of heading downward. They hadn't all turned the corner by any means, though some of them certainly had. This zero line is the corner. When you get below that zero line, the country has shrinking cases each day, fewer and fewer new cases each day. But if you look now, it's just not, the picture is not as good, really. I think it's clearly not as good. After seeing this downward angle here from March 29th, which is where I'm now starting, to about April 8th, there is a fairly steep downward recovery trend. We're not really seeing that anymore. There's still some countries, a lot of countries actually, carrying on the momentum of this are below the zero line today. Most of them even, I think, are below the zero line, Most of those are headed downwards and towards even lower growth of new cases. But there are a lot of them above the zero line, and a lot of the ones that are above the zero line are not clearly, sharply getting better. Now, there are no real runaways here. There's not a single country here in these top 25. Mexico is probably the worst in this way. But there's not a single country that's got a 20% growth rate and rising rapidly. Mexico's got 10% roughly. It's rising slowly, so that's not good. But there are a lot of countries that are just sort of barely hanging in there. They've got 5% growth rate. We can see India or Sweden or Italy. No, that's a single point from Italy. Italy on the whole, I think, is looking pretty good. It's got it's got a negative 1% growth rate, and it's not getting worse. Anyone below zero is doing pretty much okay. But the ones that are really doing well, Austria, Switzerland, have this sustained 5 or 10% reduction in daily cases. And I'd say it's almost as good to be in one of these slots where you've got, though the growth rate isn't, or the shrinkage isn't quite as high, it's dropping more quickly than these ones. So for instance, Japan is doing quite well with a 6% reduction of new cases each day, but also dropping quickly. And also in that category, we see Russia, and I think, is that Belgium? I think Russia, Belgium, and Ireland, interestingly. Ireland? We were going to look at Ireland because Ireland was showing this very problematic upward slope right here. Its new cases are growing. But if we look at it here, the rate of change of those new cases, it actually seems like we're heading in the direction in the most recent days. Ireland, see, it has this one bad point, a few bad points that has the new cases rising. Ireland's kind of in the middle right now. It had a nice trend downward, and now it seems to have blown it. And this is kind of what we're starting to see. We're going to see this in Los Angeles, especially in a couple slides from now. So Ireland is in this weird place where it's suddenly growing sharply, or at least it's heading towards growing sharply. The growth rate over the past 3 or 4 days, because each of these is an average of 3 days, is very high, or very high. This is very high, 37% growth rate averaged over 3 days, and that has it shooting off the chart here. But on the other hand, its trend overall has been pretty good. So Ireland, 2 points is not enough to make a trend. It's not enough to really believe that there's something really serious happening in Ireland yet, but there could be. 3 points is when I start to say, yeah, that's 1 point could be a coincidence, or 1 point could be an accident, 2 points could be a coincidence, 3 points is getting to be a habit. Ireland has not yet developed a habit, but it certainly isn't looking great here. But yeah, the rope chart overall, let me see if I can get out of this. The rope chart overall for all countries is not looking as good as it did just a week ago. A week ago, it really felt like everyone was headed downward, mostly headed downward. It was crossing the zero line. At this point, if you eyeball this rope chart from afar, it just looks horizontal. It looks like it's centered on zero, it's horizontal. The countries, some of them are up, some of them are down, but on the whole, the world is kind of flat in its recovery. So not as good as it used to be. Not as bad as it used to be. Look a few weeks back, and like at this point, everyone was above zero. Everyone had positive growth, nearly everyone. But right now, we seem to be reaching the steady state that we don't really want to be at, where we have a lot of new cases and deaths every day, and it's not getting any better. Those are the countries right now. I think I looked at them individually, but just in case I didn't quite. Austria, Switzerland, Japan, Ireland, Netherlands, Iran, Portugal, all looking pretty good. Mexico, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, Russia. Especially note Russia. Russia was, a week ago, was starting, the news was starting to say, oh, Russia is heading into an epidemic. And we consistently see this. It looks like Russia or India or Brazil or Ireland now is heading towards an epidemic, and it doesn't seem to stick. They head that way, and then they recover, and there's a sort of a cyclic nature to some of this, maybe, or maybe it's just that each country goes through the exact same cycle, but they go through them at different times. But Russia, in any case, right now is looking relatively good, though its growth rate is 5% in new cases every day. The trend is so sharply downward that if it continues, it's going to hit zero, and it's going to cross the zero line in a matter of days, a couple days. Let's look at Brazil briefly, because Brazil is always interesting. Brazil, which has not taken extraordinary measures to contain its virus, is seeing a 5% growth rate and steady. That does make it one of the worst in terms, you can see in this graph, in terms of its growth rate is the third worst according to the trend line, and its direction is neutral. So you certainly, Mexico is worse with a higher growth rate and trending upwards. Arguably, Saudi Arabia is worse off than Brazil because its growth rate is so much higher, almost double, but on the other hand, it's trending downward. But Brazil, which we keep an eye on, is not doing well. Let's look at India as well, because we've been particularly worried about India. India, doing better than Brazil for sure, is seeing maybe a 3% growth rate, not super high, and trending downward. So we'd like to see that below zero. We want to see all of these below zero, but India, which has been there's been some concern about India becoming a new epicenter and having 100 million deaths or something. It's entirely possible. Well, not 100 million deaths, 100 million cases. Entirely possible, but not looking likely right now. India doesn't have that many cases. These are total, not per population. This list, in order of new cases, and it's well down the list, 15th or 12th or something, and dropping. So India's doing okay. Worldwide, as this is very much just what we've been talking about, the world is flattened out. It's having 80,000 new cases every day, and though it fluctuates around this line, it's really a plateau. There's no sense that it's heading downward right now. There's no way to call that. The latest point is right on this trend line. So the world is flat, not getting better right now, not getting worse, but not getting better. And the other way of seeing that is in terms of growth, it's right at that zero line. Very slightly trending downward, so the news is slightly good worldwide from the rope chart perspective, or the thread chart in this case. The trend is very slightly downward, but not enough to really say where it's going to go. But right now, the world is balanced on the edge between falling into recovery or falling into a second wave. Deaths by country, I'm not going to spend too much time on deaths by country. These numbers end up looking a lot like the case numbers. Yeah, Belgium is a lot higher. We've talked about that some. United Kingdom, but generally things like Italy, they're recovering. Italy is recovering. United States in deaths is still rising. If we look at the United States rope chart, however, it's rising, but at least it's leveled off in terms of we're seeing here the trend line is rising, but the rope chart says this is actually looks like it's a plateau. We've been seeing this thing turning roughly, though the trend line itself doesn't show it. The points do. We have some wild points out here that the trend line is taking maybe a little more seriously than it should, and so at least one of those is just due to a change of reporting. So I would trust this one more than that trend line and say the United States is probably plateaued in deaths. And the world as a whole has probably plateaued in deaths. That has been the long-term, pretty consistent trend, but it can totally change, as we're seeing in Los Angeles, which we'll get to soon. So, this is my usual total cases by state. Those of you who've been watching me daily or anything like daily will be pleased that I finally sort of fixed the problem with New York. New York always repeats its last data point in my data set, and so I've just taken that out. Anyone who repeats where the most recent data point is the same as the previous, I've just taken it out. That does mean that the New York doesn't come as far forward as some of these. We have more recent data for New Jersey than New York, and so the line ends a little sooner, but it also means that we can now trust the lines, the trend lines shown here for New York better than we could before, because with New York reporting 0 cases on the latest day every day, it always looked like it was peaking more than it was. New York, really hard to say from this line. This is why I don't like this graph. Really hard to say that New York is doing well. Seems like it's doing quite terribly, up and up and up. But as we'll see, all we have to do is go to the next one to see that when you look at the daily new cases, New York is doing fine. New York is doing great. New York has peaked and is clearly headed downward. Now there is one new day that's problematic, which actually appears to be the largest number of new cases New York has ever seen in a day. So is New York doing great? Well, we've seen cases before where we have a mini trend downward and then things go bad. But 1 point does not a trend make. 2 points might be a coincidence. 3 points is starting to be a habit. So we'll wait for a couple days and then we'll see what we can say about New York, about whether it really is experiencing some new sort of resurgence. At this point, we have just 1 day and the trend looks good, so I'm going to say New York is fine. In fact, it's better than most. It's hard to see because New York has so many cases. It's hard to see what the patterns of these other states are. But if we look at it per capita, where New York's advantage is not nearly so clear, we start to see that here's the New York line again, looking great. We start to see that the New Jersey line is looking okay. New Jersey again was tracking New York very closely, and then kind of New York won. New Jersey is looking flat. It's not looking like it's turning down much, maybe a little bit. Rhode Island continues to be our dark horse winner in this race, or loser. It's, as we'll see later, there are some good signs on Rhode Island, but per capita, Rhode Island is the worst in the country. And Connecticut's the third, Massachusetts the fourth. And if we project this trend line to the day that we don't have from New York, New York has now fallen into 5th place. Behind that, Maryland and Illinois, and there are a few others that are doing very well. Louisiana clearly trending downward. Michigan having turned the corner visibly as well. And I'm just going to zoom in on the very bottom of this graph and see if we can see a few other states that have visibly turned the corner on from this perspective. Oh, it's hard to say. Did I miss something? Well, here's one maybe. Yeah, this is all right. Missouri, yes, nice curve there. Tennessee seems to be doing okay. Texas is showing some positive signs of turning around. Did we already say Washington? Well, we didn't. Washington State, of course, got it first, and you can see its graph has shifted a bit to the left, but it's really doing just fine. Washington State is trending downward and downward. Let's look, though, at the rope chart. The growth in new cases per day by state. What percentage growth are we seeing for each state? So first of all, notice New York is doing great on this graph as well. It's not just that it has fewer new cases each day. It's that it has something like, we're going to project this to probably about 16%, 16% drop in new cases each day. And that number is accelerating pretty quickly. That's the slope down here says that we're seeing not just fewer cases each day, but the rate of that drop is accelerating. So that's great news for New York right now. Missouri, again, there's one bad point for New York, and if that continues for 3 or 4 days, these trend lines will look very different. These are very much instantaneous trends. They're averaged over 3 days, but still, they can turn in a day if something dramatic happens. Missouri also is doing great. Michigan doing very well, 10% drop each day and accelerating. Texas, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is doing fine. Rhode Island, which was this terrible oddball, is doing quite well. Its downward trend, you can see it was way above everyone in its growth rate, which is how it got way in the lead. But now it's dropping. Those numbers are finally dropping per day, not by too much yet, 7%, but they are dropping, and that 7% number itself is rising. So we're going to see 8% drop tomorrow and 9% drop the next day, and something like that, which will make Rhode Island disappear from our list pretty quickly if it persists. Pennsylvania doing fine. Louisiana, which was a real problem spot, has some slight cause for concern now because it's trending back towards zero. As long as it stays below zero, everything's fine. The epidemic is over if it stays below zero. We will just watch those daily cases drop away because they're shrinking every day, the number of cases. But at a 4% rate, that's not very fast that they're shrinking. And if that rate is heading back towards zero, we could actually see it turn back around and go in the wrong direction. So Louisiana, we'll see, but there's something a little troubling about this trend line. It, unlike everything else we've talked about so far, below zero is trending upwards towards zero. Georgia, worth noting because Georgia is doing what almost seems like a social experiment of opening up before most people think they should. I think that's a safe assertion that Georgia is bucking the majority trend here by opening things up before a number of experts think they should. At this point, they're doing okay, barely. They've got a 2% growth rate or shrinkage rate, and that's dropping, so it's accelerating. But they've just started doing this relaxation and opening of businesses and so on, and we'll see over the next few days. It won't take long, I don't think, if this is a bad idea, for us to see that number rise above zero. But it would be cool if it turns out not to. If it turns out that they can get away with it, that'll be evidence for everyone else. And if they don't, they try it and they don't, that's also evidence for everyone else. We have this cluster here at zero who are, I guess it's worth mentioning because Washington right now is having a growth rate. So they still have a fair number of cases each day. And they're seeing kind of a resurgence, just the beginning of a possible resurgence. So that's interesting because Washington seemed to be getting over it, and this is a very early indication that they might be headed back into trouble. Washington State, Colorado. Is that Colorado? No, this is Colorado. Colorado and North Carolina. Well, Colorado is not looking quite as good. It's growing slightly, 2%, and it's accelerating, but it's so close to zero that that's nothing much to be worried about. But Colorado is opening up this coming Monday in its very most limited way, and so here again, you're looking at this graph. It's not clear that that's a good idea, but I, as I always say, I appreciate the data at least. We'll get to know if Colorado is able to pull it off. Then that tells other states that may be a little bit farther behind the curve whether they also could consider relaxing their restrictions, even if they're not looking super duper great like New York and so on is. New York, which is still headed downward, is still not, as far as I've heard, relaxing any of their restrictions. They're taking a very hard line on it, and so that they're doing the more cautious thing. Colorado, not so much. So we'll watch Colorado as well. Connecticut, Virginia, some of these middle ones, slight growth rates, 5%, slightly trending upward, a number of them. So none of these are looking great. None of them looking great. We'd like to see them below zero and trending downwards. Instead, they're above zero and trending upwards. So exactly what we don't want to see, but in both cases, so mild that maybe it's not something to really worry about. All it takes is a couple good days and these trend lines would at least be trending downwards and maybe even be below zero. Tennessee is our second to worst. It's actually looks bad enough to say it's notably bad. It's at 7% daily growth rate and more of an upward trend than other. Tennessee was one to be worried about. And then there's Ohio. Now I heard somewhere that Ohio is having some extreme outbreak in a penitentiary or something. And so maybe this is why Ohio's numbers are so bad. There's some jail or prison in Ohio that has 80% infection rate. I hear totally through the grapevine. I haven't seen any confirmed actual news stories about that. But if that's the case, if that's true, then that may be what's happening here, and that's a little bit like what we saw in Cook County Jail, which took Illinois' numbers up for a bit. But I guess the bright side is with a contained environment like that, the worst they can do is 20% more. If they've already gotten 80% infected and it's a prison, the worst that particular subpopulation can do is 20% more. Everyone gets infected. And at that point, then the growth rate for Ohio will start to drop because that particular component can no longer pull it upwards. And if the rest of the state is doing fine, then we'll see this disappear. So that's speculative. Again, I don't have confirmation on that, but we have seen this in other places. Prisons, migrant camps, homeless shelters, and of course retirement communities or care homes, old folks' homes. Those are the places where we see these massive outbreaks, and especially if it's seniors, we really are seeing high rates of deaths there as well. So we consistently see small communities, churches sometimes. Communities get it way worse than the surrounding larger community, and that may have happened in Ohio. Ohio actually doesn't look quite as bad to my eye as I remember, so it may already be starting to trend downward. Let's take a look. Yeah, oh, for sure. So Ohio was probably trending something like up here, 40%. I sort of remember that just 3 or 4 days ago. But again, 1 point might be an outlier, 2 points might be a coincidence, 3 points is starting to be a habit. So here we see Ohio with a 40% reduction, averaged over 3 days in its new cases. And so whether because of that prison or something else, Ohio is showing a sustained recovery in the very short term, enough to start to say this is probably something real. So hopefully Ohio is it's already disappeared from the extreme outlier it used to be and become just a slight outlier. And I wouldn't be surprised to see this bend downward in just the next couple days. So go Ohio. Still, none of the states looking terrible, especially with Ohio coming around. None of these states are looking terrible. Definitely we see that the rope as a whole is mostly below zero, more below zero than not. Or maybe not. If I actually counted them, we might find 12 above and 12 below, about even below and above. But what's certainly true is there are more extremely good ones or sharply downward ones here than sharply upward ones here. These bottom 6 or so are more angled than any of the upward ones. So the trend overall is good here. We have an average for the country of, I would say, of downward, below zero, turning the corner. But we have a lot of states now, I don't think we had this even a week ago, where it seems like they certainly are not beating it right now, and they are not even trending towards beating it. They're just hovering on the knife's edge of calamity. So we'll keep an eye on all those. We seldom see anyone really run away with it, except New York, which did and then got over it. So hopefully that won't happen with any of these. Let's take a look at California, which was showing some possibility of being the next one to run away with it. Well, okay, California had this outrageous growth for a couple days, but now it's got one balanced day, and now it starts to seem like, okay, maybe these really were outliers. We never quite got to the point of it being a habit. And so California has leveled off a little bit, but still 2% growth rate and rising overall. California is certainly not looking like New York or any of the other real winners here. Moving on to testing. I'm surprised. Oh, I get it. I thought I wasn't seeing Rhode Island here. But Rhode Island has, in the past few days, we've seen these numbers rise for Rhode Island and pass everyone else, but the trend line hadn't caught up. For the longest time, the trend line was still way down below this. Now the trend line has finally realized, yeah, this really is a trend. We really are heading upward. And so now even the line of Rhode Island agrees that Rhode Island is the best in testing. They have 4.2% of their population tested now, well ahead of even New York and Louisiana, which are in the well over 3+. Louisiana has something weird going on here in the data where they're testing almost no one according to the reported numbers I have. I don't believe that, so this is probably just a data problem. But in any case, Louisiana is still doing well, even if they haven't tested anyone for 4 days. They're in 3rd place. Massachusetts, New Jersey, and then a whole cluster below. Everyone is doing at least as bad as the worst, which is Virginia at 0.8% of the population. 0.8% is respectable. That's a respectable number. It's a very respectable number to have tested almost 1% of the population. So all of the states are doing pretty well. But then there are those that are doing 4 times better than pretty well, or 5 times better. So I would like to see, I keep coming back to California, I'd like to see California reach this 4+%. Now, on the bright side, California, after having a really miserable time back until April 3rd, suddenly catching up with its backlog, or at least part of its backlog apparently there, and then having a much improved time, but still in the bottom, pretty much the bottom of the states. It was never very impressive up till April 21st, has now caught up with another chunk of backlog. Caught up with reporting it, and I read some article that said they really have caught up with their backlog and they're testing everyone in a reasonably quick time now, is now above 1% thanks to that jump. Let's look at California on a per day basis. So they have these 2 crazy days. These are just something about reporting, no doubt. I don't believe they suddenly tested 15 times more people in a day than they did the day before. So this is something about a whole batch of reporting came in, probably. But regardless, that was one day, and now they're back to their usual trend. So I don't expect we're going to see this become the new normal, great as that would be. But nevertheless, with that bump, they have now moved, the trend line hasn't caught up, but they have moved into the big leagues, or at least the minors, with 1.2%. Let's compare that with others. So 1.2, we can actually, I can see their point here. They've moved out of the miserable pack into this sort of cluster here of just kind of, I mean, everyone's doing fine. 0.8 is fine, but there's so much upside here. But at least they're in the second cluster here. Colorado is still in the miserable pack. Colorado not doing very well with testing. Ohio, which really needs it, not doing well with testing. Texas is in the very bottom in testing. I guess I'll just list I would say there are roughly 4 clusters here. There are the superstars, which are in testing Rhode Island, New York, Louisiana, and Massachusetts. Then there's I'll call them the good ones. They're doing well. New Jersey, Washington State, Connecticut, Tennessee, and Mississippi. So those ones are doing well. And then there are let's say the mediocre ones, which now include California. California, Michigan, Maryland, Illinois, Florida. There might have been another one in there. And then there's the rest, which are, though they're at least above 0.8, even above 0.4 is good. But then again, this is the total percent of population tested. So there's also the question, what's the testing rate? You can test, if you test at a steady rate, you're eventually going to pass 0.4 of your population, no matter how low your rate is. So maybe more interesting, it's certainly interesting to know how much they've tested, but I do have this graph that shows what the testing rate is. And in the rate at which we're testing each day, Rhode Island in the lead, obviously in the lead. You can see their slope has just got everyone beat here. Rhode Island in the lead, and everyone else, well, okay, we've got a sort of separate pack here. New York is testing at a better rate than everyone except Rhode Island. Same with Massachusetts and Tennessee, and I guess New Jersey. And so we see these are all, what this really means is these are all pretty much lines. There are very few who are accelerating or decelerating their testing. They're all testing at whatever their capacity is. So these are all going in straight lines, and we're not going to see a lot of shuffling in the ranks because of that. But Rhode Island obviously is an exception. I'll see another exception is Tennessee here, Mississippi actually. Mississippi, which I just don't think of as, well, okay, that's why. I think Mississippi just moved into our top 25. They bumped someone who I don't even know who. But Mississippi, I don't think of as a major player in coronavirus, but they're the new kid in town here, new kid on the block, and they are out testing just about everyone except Rhode Island, or at least they're out testing their whole clump. They used to be back in the bottom here, and now they've passed at least a few. So Mississippi is doing well in testing. Let's take a look at Mississippi, because that's one that I'm sure we haven't looked at. Daily cases are rising, but what is their overall trend? Okay, Mississippi is doing okay. They're trending downward. They're at around zero growth, but they've just turned the corner, or they just are about to. So Mississippi seems to be getting a handle on this. Yeah, they seem to be doing fine, but again, they're in the top. They're 25th out of 25, so the number of cases is small, and that makes the data a little bit noisy. Let's move on to the counties of California. If you have any questions, by the way, you can drop them in the chat. I heard that chat isn't working for some, but then I sometimes get things in chat, so let me know on Facebook, if you know me on Facebook, that chat isn't working. Okay, this is the most interesting news of the day. So a couple days ago when I looked at this, I said, holy cow, Los Angeles. It's been heading upwards, sure, but it'd been looking better. And then suddenly they saw this peak of a couple days. So might be an outlier, might be a coincidence, starting to be a habit, confirmed habit. 4 straight days of much higher than usual rise for Los Angeles. We might see that it's slightly dropped here versus the previous days, but Los Angeles is on a very bad trend here. And this is what has California be on a worse trend than it was. California was looking like it was kind of balanced on the edge, California was, and now it's trending upwards again. It's above zero and trending upwards. So it's got both the characteristics we don't want. It's only a 3% growth rate. It's a very slight slope upwards, but it's all Los Angeles's fault, as you can see from this graph. Nobody else could possibly do anything with numbers as low as that could counteract that. So Los Angeles is pulling the state upwards, and we see it here in terms of this very high number, and then it's actually a mini trend downward, but it's way above the trend line. The whole trend is above the trend line. So maybe it's going to come back, and it's all going to be fine. I haven't been able to find any information about why this sudden spike would have occurred. Maybe it's just a matter of California catching up with its backlog, in which case this doesn't mean anything. It'll just resume the trend where it was, but because this just means we've finally tested a whole bunch of people, and so now we know a bunch of people were positive that we didn't know before, but they were always positive, and it doesn't change the trend. So hopefully that's the case. And this very latest data point does start to suggest that. When we look in the very short term, California's trend is downward. And we'll see on the rope chart, it's actually going to look okay because the trend is downward. But if you look over the long term, the trend is clearly upwards, and these 4 points are the whole reason for that. Let's go to per million. Looking per capita, I'll zoom in a little bit because we don't care about these. Well, it's worth mentioning we have a really, really high data point from Imperial, and then a few other very high data points from Imperial. Something's going on in Imperial, I tell you. They just popped onto the graph a few days ago, and now they've moved into 24th place from 25th. If you look at these graphs, Imperial is certainly seriously trending, or seriously headed upwards. We'll see. This is not the rope chart. This is per million, so we aren't really seeing yet where they're headed, but we can certainly see that their trend at this point is towards rising daily cases. Whether they're accelerating or not in that remains to be seen on the rope chart. Los Angeles is actually behind Imperial per capita, and then there's Riverside. Everyone else is relatively small compared to those. San Francisco is now showing a nice downward trend, so which was in the top 3 or 4, has actually fallen to, I think, just barely to 5th place now, behind San Bernardino in per capita, and we're really starting to see San Francisco show signs of a recovery, which is good because it was just a little bit ago they had some kind of like Cook County Jail, kind of like Ohio's alleged penitentiary. We had the situation with a homeless shelter get out of control in San Francisco, and that took their numbers briefly upwards. Then they recovered, it seems, or they're at least, it's looking good for San Francisco. Zooming in, also Tulare has gotten that nice downward trend we like to see. Kern turned the corner and heading downward. Santa Clara, good to see that, because Santa Clara had an upward trend just recently. It was not doing well on any of these charts, as I recall. Solano also trending downward, and but in Contra Costa. So we'll see all those as the counties that are negative in their growth rate on the rope chart. Looking at the rope as a whole, actually, before I zoom in, looks pretty flat to me. Maybe even slightly upward angled, which we know that California right now as a whole is slightly upward angled, so we would expect this rope chart to be heading a little above zero. It certainly looked a lot better. It is right on the edge again. We're seeing this all over the place, where it seems like everything is on the edge of a new epidemic. And so we have a lot of counties that are that have both strikes against them of being above zero, that zero line, positive growth in new cases each day, and accelerating, 2 strikes. And then we have a lot of counties that have both, whatever you call it, the opposite of a strike, runs, I don't know, hits, where they have 2 going for them. I don't know what is with me in sports references today. My sister will be amused. We have two things going for them where they're both negative growth and accelerating. We have that for a lot of the counties, and in fact, it's just this. I don't know if bifurcation is a word, but I'm going to say it is. There's a bifurcation of the graph where it's splitting into 2 independent trends. And we could kind of see this going back to here. And they, at this point, they've actually opened the gap right here, right at the zero line. There's nobody. Everyone above zero, without exception, well, maybe there's one exception, is trending even farther upwards. Everyone below zero, without exception, is trending downwards. How about dichotomy? I know that's a word. If bifurcation won't work, we'll say there's a dichotomy here. And so Imperial in the lead is growing faster than the rest, but the other ones that are doing poorly, Los Angeles, Fresno, Marin, San Diego. And then there are the ones that are still not doing as poorly, but still above zero and rising. We could say that San Bernardino is dropping. It's pretty flat, but still above zero in its growth rate. Alameda, Orange, San Mateo, Contra Costa, and Ventura. So those are this is like, I say this like the Sharks and the Jets. This is the wrong side of the railroad tracks here. We've got the zero line. We have all of these counties which are rising, getting worse, bad and getting worse. And then there's all the good ones: Sonoma, San Luis Obispo, Placer, Tulare, relatively small in contribution, but getting smaller. Oh, and look, Monterey's burst back on the scene. Someone got so much better that Monterey's back, barely in the top 25. San Joaquin, we were seeing San Joaquin was a little iffy, looking pretty good now. San Joaquin, Kern, Santa Barbara, Riverside, glad to say, is dropping. Riverside has just been rising. I think that was in the middle when I started doing this, and Riverside has just been troubled. But Riverside is showing a slight 4% downward trend and accelerating. Solano, San Francisco, also a slight downward trend and accelerating. Santa Clara, downward and accelerating. Stanislaus, Monterey. Monterey is back, and it's looking okay. So I would be very interested to see if these continue to diverge. Certainly the trends suggest they should, that we look at this tomorrow, we'll see an even bigger gap around zero, with all of these ones headed farther upwards and all these headed farther downwards. But there is a reversion to the mean here that will probably happen, where if they're too far out of whack, they will tend to head back towards zero. Maybe in both cases, the really far ones, well, the ones that go far enough fall off the graph entirely, but those that are extreme, we never see someone with a 50% growth rate or a negative 50% growth rate. We tend to see them all hanging out in this 20 to negative 20 range. And it's not the same ones typically. So someone who's negative 20 will tend to be negative 10 in a few days. Someone who's 20 will tend to be 10 in a few days. And so everyone eventually is attracted back to this zero line. But hopefully, what we hope really is that the big ones are the ones that we see negative growth on. And if we have to see positive growth, it'd be nice if it were the little ones. But that's not what we're really seeing right now. The ones that I was looking through. Actually, let's just see that. The ones that I saw that were looking best were the smaller counties, or the ones with fewer cases anyway. If you look at the top 5, certainly Los Angeles is looking bad right now, though again the mini trend suggests that might not last. But in San Diego also looking pretty bad, and then orange in the middle, which is conveniently colored orange on this graph. Santa Clara and Riverside are both looking good. So we've got kind of a mix, but certainly overall it doesn't look good for the top 5 counties, because the ones that are below zero are barely below zero. The ones that are above zero are way above zero. We throw in San Francisco, Alameda, it still just feels like, yeah, it feels like we're averaging 5% or something. A lot of them around 5%. There are a few that are 10% above that, and a few that are 10% below that, but that still puts the average at 5%. So the counties are not looking great right now. On the whole, California is not looking great right now. Certainly nothing to be alarmed about, but if this is an indicator of when to relax some of the things we've been doing, the indicator is not flashing green. Finally, the population, or the testing by county. We're now seeing Riverside is doing some very good testing. We're seeing Riverside has tested 1.4% of its people, and San Francisco as well. Those are good numbers. They're not the 4% that Rhode Island's doing, but they're good numbers. And then San Mateo and Marin also doing pretty well. San Diego doing pretty well. Santa Clara, San Luis Obispo is not doing that well with only 0.3% tested. But most of the other ones we have data for here are doing all right. And then there are some we have no data for that I'm sure they're not. It's not that they're not testing. And I always wonder about this wild kern graph. This is probably just, yeah, we just for whatever reason, this is a volunteer effort, Corona Data Scraper, whoever was collecting for kern just stopped, I think. And so we just don't have data anymore for kern. But back when we knew about them, they had already hit 0.9%. So this is not a serious problem. In all likelihood, they have continued upward, and they're at above 1%. And if this mini trend is anything, they might be the best of all. So kern's probably doing okay. We just don't have data. All right, that's the news. Not as good as it's sometimes been. On the level of the counties, we have this odd split of the ones that are doing well and getting and heading in even towards even better, doing poorly and heading towards even worse. On the level of the states, we have a better trend, but and no one doing really terribly, and Ohio definitely recovering from being that extreme outlier to being just a mild outlier. And New York doing great. And at the level of countries, we have it's kind of mixed. Countries are flat. That rope looks straight to the right to me. So I wish I could say the world was recovering. Right now, a number of things seem to be hanging in the balance. The recovery is not imminent for the world, but we'll keep watching. My name is Greg Farrar, and this is the COVID-19 Trends live stream. Thanks for watching.